One of the funnier questions, though, that I thought Powell was asked during this interview was the guy interviewing him said, hey, you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and I'm sure a lot of people out there, would aspire to one day be chairman of the Federal Reserve. So, what does it take? What kind of person, what kind of background, what should people study? If other people want to follow in your footsteps and they want to one day be the chairman of the Federal Reserve, what do you recommend? I'm laughing to myself as I'm hearing this because, obviously you got to be completely clueless about economics. You have to have absolutely no understanding about money or banking. It helps to be a real good liar, right? He did say that there are a lot of people who used to be lawyers who are working at the Fed, and they're generally pretty good liars. So, maybe a legal background would help you at the Fed. But certainly any legitimate understanding of economics would hurt you. I think maybe public relations, maybe he should say that people should be communication majors and in marketing, because that's really what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to BS everybody and con everybody. And in fact, on that subject, also today, Bernie Madoff died in prison. I think he was 82 years old. And Bernie Madoff's background is ideal for chairman of the Fed. He ran a Ponzi scheme, and that's exactly what the U.S. government is doing, is running a Ponzi scheme. In fact, Bernie Madoff may in fact be dead, but the greatest purveyor of Ponzi schemes is alive and well and lives on in the U.S. government. Bernie Madoff was a piker of Ponzi schemes when compared to the U.S. government. And so operating a private Ponzi scheme is a good job prerequisite for being Fed chairman. Certainly, Bernie Madoff would have made a good Fed chairman. He would have made an even better Secretary of the Treasury, which is something I often joked about. I said, why do we have Bernie Madoff in jail? We should have made him Secretary of the Treasury, because he is an expert in Ponzi schemes, and that is what the U.S. Treasury is operating. The U.S. government really operates two gigantic Ponzi schemes, one in Social Security, right? That's pure Ponzi, right? That's all it is, right? It's, we take money in from the people who are currently working, and then we give that money to the people who retire. And we promise the people who are currently working, when you retire, we'll take money from the new crop of workers. That is pure Ponzi. That is the definition of Ponzi. It's just that everybody knows it's a Ponzi, and the government requires you to participate, even though you know it's a Ponzi. Because most people, if they had a choice, would opt out of Social Security. They wouldn't want to take part in it, because most Ponzi operators, they have to keep it quiet. They can't tell you that it's a Ponzi scheme, because once you know, well, you're not going to participate. But the government doesn't even have to hide it, because they're forcing you to participate whether you want to or not. That's why this particular Ponzi scheme is able to last a lot longer than others. But there's another Ponzi scheme that's a little less obvious than the Social Security Ponzi, and that is the Ponzi scheme regarding financing of the U.S. national debt, right? All the debt. How does the U.S. government pay interest to its current bondholders? Well, it borrows the money from future bondholders. Now, when the bonds that the government sold in the past mature, where does the government get the money to pay off the lenders? Well, it gets it by borrowing more money from new lenders. Well, that again is a Ponzi scheme. Now, more and more, those new lenders are the Federal Reserve. So the government is getting money from the Federal Reserve to pay off the maturing bonds. And where is it going to get the money to pay off the Fed when those bonds mature? Well, they'll get that money from the Fed too. So the entire thing is a Ponzi scheme, except here, nobody is actually forced to participate, right? The Chinese, the Japanese, individuals, nobody is required to buy U.S. treasuries, which is why the U.S. government should have kept the Ponzi-like nature of this finance mechanism quiet. See, that's why I thought Bernie Madoff would have been a much better Secretary of the Treasury than a lot of the clowns that we've had. Because oftentimes, right, every time we get to the debt ceiling, you'll always hear the Secretary of the Treasury talking about how important it is to raise the debt ceiling, although we don't even talk about it anymore because we've basically suspended the ceiling. But back when we still had it and we had to raise it, whoever was the Secretary of the Treasury would always say, hey, we have to raise the debt ceiling, otherwise we're going to default, right? That's why we have to raise the debt ceiling, because, we have to pay our bills. Well, I used to say, well, the reason we're raising the debt ceiling is because we don't pay our bills. If we paid our bills, we wouldn't have all this debt. We wouldn't have to raise the ceiling. The only reason we're raising the ceiling is because we don't pay our bills. We borrow the money instead, and we want to keep on doing that. But I always pointed out how foolish it was to remind our creditors that we're just a debt ceiling away from default, because that is an admission of a Ponzi scheme. Because the Secretary of the Treasury didn't say, well, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we'll cut government spending so that we can pay our bondholders, or if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to raise taxes so we have more money to pay the debt. No, they said if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're just going to default. In other words, if we can't bring more people into the Ponzi scheme, we're just going to default on the commitments that we made to the people who are already in the scheme. And so what I was always saying was, look, Bernie Madoff would never make that kind of mistake, right? It is Ponzi 101. When you are running a Ponzi scheme, the last thing you want to do is tell people it's a Ponzi scheme, right? You got to keep that real quiet. You got to at least pretend, right, that you're going to pay your bills. So maybe Bernie Madoff, being an expert in Ponzi's, having kept his going for as long as he did, he may have been better at conning the world so that it wouldn't recognize the Ponzi nature of what was going on. The crazy thing about it is, even though we told the world that it's a Ponzi scheme, the world is that dumb and they continue to loan us money. And that's part of the reason that we haven't already seen a collapse in the U.S. Treasury market, right? People still don't get it. Even with all this money printing and these huge deficits, and even with all of these price hikes, right? Bond investors are complacent. They're sitting there. They're staring at potentially double-digit inflation, right? The 1970s on steroids. They're looking right at that, and they're just there. They're not selling their bonds. It's like they're like a deer in the headlights, right? They're staring at this headlight from an oncoming car, and they're kind of confused or mesmerized or scared. And so they just sit there, and then they get hit by a car and die. Well, that's what's going to happen to these bond market investors. They're sitting there like a deer in a headlight. They're confused. They don't know what's going on. And the next thing you know, they're going to be flattened by a Mack truck, and they're going to be dead because their bonds are going to be killed by inflation. That's the biggest losers for inflation. It's not people in the stock market. It's not people who own real things. It's people who own paper. Oh, and by the way, that also includes people who own nothing, which is Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, because at least the dollar is on a piece of paper. And so when the dollar has no value as money, you can still do something with that paper. I mean, you can wipe your behind with it. I mean, maybe it's not the softest thing to use, but if that's all you got, it's better than nothing.
The Peter Schiff Show.